This is a Made Label sew-along tutorial for the Freya Belle wrap dress. You can purchase the pattern at the link on the screen, and if you need any help assembling it, check out our studio/assemble link. The Freya Belle is part of our wrap collection. So once you've sewn up the Freya Belle, if you love the top, you can make it with new skirt options, or if you love the skirt, you can make it with new top option. Or buy a new pattern and sew up all 4 dress combinations. You will be able to buy them as single garments and also sew them up as single garments. To see all the patterns available in the wrap collection, you can check out the link on the screen, which will also be listed below. To make this pattern, you will need a woven or non-stretch material. We recommend rayon or viscose, or something with a similar weight and drape. Always pre-wash and iron your fabric before you start cutting, and then you can avoid any kind of shrinkage that is going to happen. To choose your size, you want to refer to the finished measurement chart. We recommend to focus on the bust area, and if you want a tighter fitted top or one that's a little bit low cut, you can go to a very similar size as your full bust measurement. If you wanted a higher cut or more relaxed fit, then add up to 4 centimeters ease or extra space on top of your full bust measurement. And if you want the best fit, we always recommend sewing up a sample out of an old duvet or some scrap fabric that you have around, even if it's just the 2 top sections. We give back with every pattern, and you can check that out at madelabel.co/givingback. On page 4 of your pattern, you'll find your cutting plan and also information on how much fabric you need to make the dress, as well as the amount of bias that you will need for the facing and the ties. You can cut the skirt to a mini, midi or maxi length, and to help save paper, you can also check out which pages you will need to print if you are cutting it to a shorter length than the maxi. So for place on fold pattern pieces, you want to fold your fabric in half, making sure that your selvage edge is an equal distance away from the folded edge the whole way down where you're going to cut. You then want to line up your place on fold part of the pattern with that folded edge. Make sure that your grain line is in line with the folded edge and the selvage edge and is going in the direction of the pattern. You're going to cut the whole way around the pattern except that fold line, making sure that you cut out that little triangle, as that is going to help you line up the 2 pattern pieces of the top. And when you finish cutting, you're going to open up the pattern and reveal symmetrical sides of your place on fold pattern piece. Moving on to the other type of pattern, which is a mirror cut pattern piece. We're going to be using the Freya top panel and marking out the darts and also notches for gathering. So using either a pin or some type of punching tool, you want to punch holes in all of the areas where you can see that you're going to need to mark. You can use this same technique on any other notches you need to mark on your patterns. So lining up the grain line with the selvage edge, you want to weigh down your pattern pieces, and this time you're going to cut the entire way around the pattern. Again, making sure that you cut around the little triangle and take your time cutting out these pattern pieces. Getting accuracy when you are cutting out patterns is going to make such a difference to your sewing experience and the end garment. And for slippy fabrics like a rayon, or especially if you're using a silk or anything like that, a rotary cutter and rotary mat will absolutely change your life instead of trying to do it with scissors. So once you've finished cutting the whole way around, we're going to mark on those pre-punched holes all of the dart and notch marks. Make sure you are using a pen that is going to iron off and not something that is going to stain your fabric. Then before you move any of your weights, you want to just make sure that all your notches are clear and that you can see them on the pattern. Then you're going to line up the dot of the dart with the edges and make sure that you get a nice clear straight line. You want to mark in both the middle of the dart and the two dart legs, which are the outer lines. Also, make sure that you darken up the two notch marks that you're going to gather between. And the most important part of a mirror cut pattern is making sure that you make its pair. So you can do this by either flipping it over and cutting on the opposite side, or you can fold your fabric over like you're cutting a place on fold pattern piece and cut them both at the same time. If you are starting out, it can be easier to cut them separately, as you will find you'll get a little bit more movement when your fabric is folded in half. And make sure that you mark all of your dart and notches on the opposite side. And a little hack, it can be easier to make these marks when your material is facing the wrong side up. And when you finish, you're going to have mirror versions of the same pattern piece. So we're going to start the construction by sewing the darts and gathering. We're going to sew between the notches to make a gather under your bust. If you have a smaller chest, you may find it better to sew the entire way along the bottom of the pattern so you don't have fabric gathered where you don't have much bust. We are going to sew it now, but we won't be gathering till later, so you can try it on, or if you've made a sample, you can get it right in the sample stages. To sew the dart, we're going to start by folding it in half and pinning it. So to fold in half, you want to match the two dart legs at the point that they start. Once you have these perfectly matched, you're going to pin as if you're sewing down this line. So then you're going to be able to see if it's matching on the right and the wrong side. And you want to make sure that middle line is right on the crease. You want to pin the whole entire way down, and you can see when you're pinning along the line that the line is going to be matching up on either side of the fabric. Next, I use a little pattern hack to make sure nothing moves, but if you are using a delicate fabric, you can just leave those first pins. By placing the pins across the line, you're going to be able to remove the first pins and sew over the pins so you're not having to pull things out at the sewing machine, and you won't get any movement on the fabric, so the dart will be nice and straight. If you are using rayon, lace pins work quite well because they are so slim. At the machine, you're going to sew very slowly along that dart leg. You can do a little back stitch or tie it off at the top. As you come towards the end of the dart, you just want to curve the machine a little bit towards the folded edge, and then sew right off the end of the fabric. Pull quite a long thread and cut it off. Still at the machine, we're going to sew a basting stitch. So you will need to change your stitch length to a longer stitch length, around 4 or the longest one you have, so that you can gather these stitches later. So starting with the notch near the side seam, you want to start a few stitches forward and back stitch. Then you're going to sew 1/4 inch away from the side of the seam all the way till you reach the second notch. Make sure that you pull a very long thread before cutting it off. You're then going to go back to the same starting point, starting a few forward and doing back stitches, then sewing 1/4 inch away from that first basting line, and again finishing at the second notch and pulling a very long thread to finish. And you'll end up with 2 lines of basting stitches 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter apart. So you can see that you're now going to have a stitch along those dart legs. Next, you want to tie off the strings at the end of the dart. So you may need to untwist them and then just do some simple knots, making sure that that is not going to come undone and will wear well. You can also do this at the start of the dart if you didn't use any back stitching. Snipping those threads, you can then pull out your pins. Remember, if you're using a super delicate fabric, you may not want to use those cross pins. We're then going to iron the dart flat, but make sure you stay away from the point of the dart. You just want to iron the top section of the dart flat. Opening up your top, you want to make sure that you're pressing the dart down towards the bottom. So ideally you would have a tailor's ham here, but we're going to show you a little hack for those who don't. So instead of ironing it flat, what you want to do whenever you're ironing the point of the dart is make sure that you're lifting the fabric off the ironing board. That will allow you to press enough heat into the corner of the dart without making any marks or puckers. So you can see it finishes beautifully. And you'll also have your 2 lines of gathers at the bottom of each pattern piece. We're going to do a little bit of stay stitching around the neckline of the pattern pieces. These are just a simple stitching line along the very edge of the pattern piece that stops it from warping when you handle and store your patterns during the project before you finish the neckline. We're going to sew this line of stitching along the back V and across the 2 front pattern pieces on the neckline. It's just a simple straight line of stitching as close to the edge as you possibly can make it. We're going to sew the frill for the top with French seams, and starting with the back frill, you're going to pin the center back seam with wrong sides together. And both of the ends of that center back frill, you're then going to pin the arm frills. Since filming this tutorial, we have added little notches to the patterns to make it easier to line up. So start with lining those up and pin from the middle out. So you can see there's going to be 2 ends of the center back frill where you will join both of the arm frills. You want to make sure that they're going inwards to make a circle shape, and you're going to want to pin them wrong sides together. Pinning this frill can get a little bit confusing, but just remember that you want to pin the frill so it's always heading in towards the center and making what looks like a giant circle. Once you've finished one arm frill, you can pin the other one to the other side of the back frill. We're then going to join on the front frill to the other side of the arm frill. Again, you want to make sure that you're having a circle that's coming in towards each time, and you're going to pin them wrong sides together. Once you've pinned both of the front frills to both of the arm frills, you're then going to sew the first seam of the Frenchie along all those pinned seam edges. This first seam is going to be 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter across. At the sewing machine, you want to start a few stitches forward, do your back stitch, and then sew a straight line of stitching straight down all of these seams. Once you have that seam, you want to press it once to set the stitches. Then you're going to go and trim it less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter. You then want to open it up and give that seam a good press, making sure that it's flat. Then turning the fabric inside out, you want to press that seam to the outside edge. You may need to wriggle it a little bit with your finger. If you feel that you need it, you can put a few pins in to hold it straight for the next seam. And you're going to want to press every seam on your frill before going back and sewing 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter seam at the machine. Again, do a few back stitches, then 1 straight stitch along the edge of each seam. Once you've sewn all your seams, you're going to want to press them all flat. Then you can open up each seam, pressing the French seam to one side. And you're going to have beautiful French seams on each of the frill seams. Lastly, you can go around and trim any uneven edges on the outer edge of the frill, especially where the center back joins. You may want to just circle this off a little bit, which will make it easier to hem. Next, we're going to be sewing the ties into the side seams of the top. So you're going to need 2 bias strips that are about 29 centimeters long or 11.5 inches. To make bias, you're going to cut a square along the self-edge edge. Now you are going to need quite a bit of bias for this project, and you can find out how big to cut your square on page 4 of your pattern. Once you have your square, you're going to cut 3.5 centimeters or 1 1/3 strips the entire way diagonally across it. And if you haven't made bias before and you need a quick tutorial, check out this link, and we'll also link it below in the notes. So we want to close one end of the bias ties. So you want to open it out and then fold the end in like a little parcel. And then once you've got it all folded, you want to press that flat. You then want to fold it in half again and then tuck any little edges that are poking out back in, and then give it a pin and one more press. At the machine, you then want to sew as close as you can down the edge of the open strip of bias. You want to sew right to the end, put your needle down, and then give a pivot and sew right off the corner. Sewing bias strips is a very good example of why pressing is so important. They may look a little wavy, but once you give them a good press, they'll come out straight. We're then going to sew these ties into the side seams of the top. Starting with a tie that will be sewn on the inside, we're going to measure up 18 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch and mark. You then want to get your tie and line it up with the top of that mark, and then you want to pin it in place. You should have just a little bit of an overhang over the edge of the top. After it's pinned in place, you're going to pin wrong sides together, the side, back and front panel of the top. You should have wrong sides together with the tie sandwiched in between. At this stage, you're only going to have a tie on one of the side seams of the top, and it doesn't matter which one you choose. The other side seam will just be pinned regularly with wrong sides together. Then at the machine, you're going to sew that first step of the French seam, which is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter down both seams. And as with the other French seams, you're going to press it in place. And you're going to see when you open up the side that you've sewn the tie into, that it is nicely sewn into there on the inside of the top. So then you're going to go back and, as per usual, the French seam, trim to less than 1/4 of an inch on both of the seams that you sewed. You're then going to want to press both seams flat. Then flipping it over, you're going to press that seam to the outside edge, rolling it with your fingers if you need to, and you can see that tie coming out nicely. And again, you can pin if you feel you need to. And we are going to finish this seam off with 1/4 of an inch. But first we're going to sew the other tie into the outside of the top. So you should have already trimmed and pressed the seam edge. And we're going to again mark 3/4 of an inch up or 1.8 centimeters from the bottom. And then you're going to take your tie and put the very edge of it in towards that seam as close as you can and pin it in place. And the bottom of the tie should be lining up with the mark that you made, and it should be straight across. Then you want to flip the top over and pin that in place the whole way down. And then you're going to be able to see that your strap is sandwiched in that seam. So we're going to return to the sewing machine and sew 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter along both those seam lines. When you are sewing the second one over the tie, you can give a little back stitch just to reinforce the tie. Now all that's left to do is press the seam flat, and you are going to have 2 ties inside of your French seams. On this inside tie, you do want to press the French seam forward, as it will pull that way when you tie the dress. And on the other seam of your top, after you take your pins out, you will see that your tie is beautifully sandwiched on the outside. You are going to want to press this flat, and you can see the little point where we reinforced it. And to match the other seam, you can also press it forward. So in one seam, you're going to have it on the inside and the other on the outside. And that is the main part of your top, all constructed and put together. Next, we're going to use some more bias to add facing to the armhole. So you're going to need 2 lengths of bias. And you need enough that's going to fit all the way around the outside edge of the armhole. So you want to open up one side of your double bias tape, and leaving just a little bit of overhang at the start, you're going to place the bias tape onto the armhole and pin it right sides together. To continue to pin all the way around the outside edge of the armhole, and when you get to the dart, you want to make sure that the dart is laying flat and that it is facing towards the bottom of the top. Once you get to the end of the armhole, you're going to use that folded line as a guide to sew all the way around the outside edge of the armhole. You want to start right on that little bit of overhang and just use that folded line as the guide. And once you've pinned and sewn all the way around both armholes, you want to come back and trim back the edge of that dart. We're then going to come in, and with tiny scissors, you're going to cut little triangles all the way around the armhole. This is so when you fold the bias tape in, it helps that there's not as much fabric there and it will sit flat. The first thing you want to do is fold the bias to that sewn edge, and then you're just going to roll it in again and pin it down on itself. So that sewn edge should be on the outside of the seam. And once you've pinned it in place, you're going to continue along, folding to that first sewn edge and then rolling down again and pinning in place. Once you get the hang of this, this is actually quite a therapeutic task. And once everything is in place, give it a quick press because it's just going to make it easier to sew at the machine. So you're going to go back to the machine now and sew as close as you feel comfortable to the outside edge of the bias. You are going to need to take this slow and take the pins out as you go, turning the fabric as you sew around the curved edge. And then you're going to give it a final press, and you'll see you've got beautiful bias facing on the inside of the armhole. Now the next part of this project is probably one of the trickier parts of the sew. We're going to, with an iron, do a double rolled hem. So first you're going to start by rolling the hem in around 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch. And you may find that when you're starting out that your seam allowance is a little bit bigger than this, but don't worry, it won't affect your project overall. Now the trick when you're doing this is to slightly pull the fabric so it curves a little as you are sewing. And a little hack is, if you get to any particularly tricky parts, it's best to really dampen down the fabric so it's almost wet, as it will make it much more pliable. And just take your time. This is definitely a tricky part and it's not an easy thing for anyone. So just put on a good movie and enjoy the project. So next you're going to come back and roll the hem in again, another 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch. Just remember, the trick here is to really give it a pull as you're folding it. As it's on the bias, it will really help it fold over. There are areas where you're going to have a little bit too much fabric as you are folding the fabric in on itself. So just dampen these areas down. Take it nice and slowly and make sure that you have a lot of steam happening in your iron, so you're really pressing everything in place as you go. And once you've finished double rolling the whole hem, we're going to sew right on the inside edge of that double rolled hem, as close to the edge as you feel comfortable. Just take this nice and slow. Use your left hand just to really help guide the fabric around. Once you've finished sewing, the frill may look a little wavy, so you really want to give it a good press. You can even go around twice because you want those stitches set in and for the frill just to be able to flutter nicely in the breeze. So next we're going to attach the frill to the top, starting at the center back. So you want to match the center back seam of your frill with the V in the back of your top. And with right sides both facing up, you're going to pin the frill onto the back of the top. Now the start of the arm frill should start just where the V of the top ends, and you're going to pin it all the way to this point. The arm frill isn't going to be attached to any part of the top because it is going to drape over your arm. So you want to go back and pin the other part of the back of the frill so it's pinned all the way along the V and stops at both sides, the beginning of the arm frill. Next, we're going to pin the frill on the front top panel. You want to line up where the seam of the arm frill ends, where that sewn line of the bias is, and pin that in place. Make sure that you pin straight across where you're going to join that strap. Then you want to continue pinning all the way down the front top panel. And take a quick second to make sure that your arm frill isn't twisted before you do all of the pinning. And when you reach the end, just pin it in place, and then you can snip off that tiny bit that is left. We're then going to sew a holding seam as close to the edge as possible, and you're going to do this on the front and also the back where you've pinned. Keep it as close to the edge as you possibly can. See, your front and back frill will now be attached, and you can snip off those little extra bits of bias that are sticking out. Next, we're going to tack on the straps. So you want to cut two 2-inch or 5-centimeter bits of stitched up bias for the back loops, and we're going to thread the 2 little ring loops onto those. For the front straps, you're going to need to cut 2 longer lengths of bias and close them at one end, the same like you did for your ties. Check your pattern for the measurements of how long your strap should be. So firstly, you're going to take your 2 little back straps and pop on the loops, and you want to then pin them closed. You then want to mark 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch from the top of the loop on both of the little back strap loops. So now we're ready to tack the straps onto the dress. Starting with the front strap, you want to lay it down on the top, making sure it's on a vertical axis to the top, and put that raw end at the top of the dress. First, lay your straps down and make sure that it's lining up in the place where the strap is supposed to go on the other side of the top. You can pull it over and even try it on for a little test run here once you've got all the straps pinned. Especially on the front straps, it can make a huge difference where you place it. For the back straps, we're going to put them just in this little corner where you have a cut across straight section. So you want to get your loop and lay the 1 centimeter mark that you made on the start of the top so it lines up with that flat section on the back of the top. Once you think you have it in the right place, just give it a little pin. And again, give it a little test and flip it over to make sure that it's pulling up straight and in the right place. Make sure that it's got a vertical line to the back of the top once you flip it over. And when you have both back straps pinned in place, give them a flip and make sure that the space between the ring and where you've pinned it is equal on both sides. And now you're going to tack all of the straps in place. So using the same color thread as you're using to sew, you just want to tack the straps in place on both sides of the strap. You want to tack all 4 straps in place and then give the top one more try on. Keep in mind the top strap is going to be a little bit long as you're going to add the adjustable strap later. I want to start by joining the back panel to the 2 side panels by joining up the little notches on the side seams, and then you want to pin wrong sides together the entire way down both seam lines. On both of the seams you want to close with French seams. If you need a reminder on how to sew French seams, you can skip back to an earlier part of the video or reference the steps on the screen. And once you've sewn up all your beautiful French seams, you want to press them all forward. So you want to start with the mitered corners, which will be on the corners of the front panel. On both sides leading up to the corner, you want to press 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. Make sure that it's pressed really well by going over it a couple of times. You then want to come back and roll another 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter and press again. Make sure you're using quite a lot of steam so it is really set in place. Again, making sure that it's set in place, just giving it that extra double steam. Next, you want to open out just 1 fold of the corner, and you want to mark around 1/3 inch or 7 millimeters away from the center point on both sides. Then using those marked points, you want to draw a line straight across the corner. From there, you want to fold the corner in half so both of the lines are matching up, and then you want to pin it in place. Make sure that the lines are matching on both sides. You're then going to sew straight across that line at the machine. You can start just on the edge and you want to sew all the way to the front and then also backstitch across the line again just to make sure that it's secure. And you can see you'll have a line of stitching straight across the drawn line, and you can snip the corner off just below that stitch line. Then flip the corner in, and using something like a pen you can poke it so it's nice and straight, and then you can press your mitered corner. If this is your first time doing a mitered corner, make sure that you flip it in and test it before you give it a snip just to make sure everything's working. And from there, you want to continue to press the double rolled seam, starting with your first pass at 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter the entire way around the outside of the skirt. And then you're going to come back and do the second pass again at 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. Remember that if you slightly pull the fabric as you roll it, it will make it a lot easier to do the double rolled hem. From there, you're going to sew your hem all the way on the inside edge of that double rolled seam, making sure that you stop and pivot at the corners. Take it nice and slow and use your left hand just to guide the fabric. And when you come to that corner, you want to get on the very edge, keep your needle down and then pivot and slowly take off again to make sure that your material doesn't get caught in the machine. Lastly, you want to give it a really good press. As you want it to hang really straight on the front of the skirt, you want to press down and steam, trying not to pull the fabric in any way, but giving it just an excellent steam the whole way around. So we're going to start off with a little hack that you can use to match pattern pieces. So the back top panel should just be a little bit bigger than the back skirt panel. This is intentional but can happen on accident with any project. So on the pattern piece that's bigger, you want to sew one line of basting stitch just across the back. This is a longer length stitch so that it just pulls in easily. So starting at the side seam with long threads pulled, you want to sew with your long stitch length 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter away from the bottom of the pattern piece, all the way from one seam edge to the other. Now you'll probably find that if you've just got 1 centimeter or 2 of extra space, that just adding in this line of stitching is going to fix all of your problems. If in any project you ever did have more than that, just add a second line of basting stitch. You then want to mark the halfway points on the back top panel and the back skirt panel. And then you are going to line these up, and you will find that adding that basting stitch across the back top panel has gotten rid of any extra room. And if you do find that there is still a little bit of space, you can gather it in just the slightest amount, but I would say for this project you are not going to need to. So we are going to be joining these with a French seam. So as all of the French seams, we are pinning wrong sides together, and you want to pin the whole way across the back panel and make sure that your side seams are going to be matching up perfectly. And from that side seam, we're going to pin the front top panel and the front skirt panel together. So you'll see a little bit of room there just before the gathering on the front top panel starts, and you can pin that in place. We then want to pin where we want the top to end, and you want that to be 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 of an inch in from the end of the top, and mark that on both sides. You then want to line up this mark with where your skirt is ending, and making sure that there's a straight line, just pin it in place. And from there, we're going to take this extra room we have and use it for the gathers. You want to take the top 2 threads of the gathered stitching and just gather that in until the front top panel and the skirt panel fit together perfectly. And from there, you just want to make sure that all of the gathers are evenly spaced. Then you want to pin everything in place all the way along the front top panel, and you're going to repeat this exact same process on the other side. And once everything is pinned in place, you're going to start that French seam with 3/8 of an inch or a 1 centimeter seam. You want to sew straight across all the gathers, and it is best if the top is facing up so that you can make sure that all your gathers are sewing straight as you go over them. We're then going to trim back to less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter. You do want to make sure that your skirt is facing up so you can clearly see the one line of stitching. Then you want to open the seam up and press it flat the whole way along, and flip it over and press that seam to the outside edge. You are going to want to come back and make sure that all your gathers are pressed really nicely and that nothing is going to sew strangely at the machine. Then you're going to finish off the French seam with a 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter seam. Again, make sure that your top is facing up so that you can just clearly see when you're sewing over the gathers and everything is sewing nice and straight. Finally, you want to give that French seam a press towards the bottom of the dress. And you'll see that all your gathers are beautifully sewn into the French seam. And you should have just a little bit of overhang at the edge, which is going to get turned over and tucked inside your bias facing. So the first thing you want to do is mark the halfway point on your bias facing length. To find out how long your length should be, check page 4 of your pattern and it will give you the exact measurement for that length of facing. So you want to take that halfway point and you're going to open up one edge of the bias facing and place it in the V at the back of your dress and pin that in place. As you did with the bias on your underarm, you want to continue to pin those raw edges together with the right side of the facing and the right side of the top together. When you reach any of the straps, you just want to sandwich those in between the bias facing and the top. And you want to continue that bias facing all the way over the frill of the arm and down the front of the top, sandwiching in all of the straps as you go. And once you reach the end of the top, you just want to pin all the way off the edge, making sure that that folded line that you're going to sew down covers all those raw edges. Another little sewing hack to make sure your straps are straight is you want to find where your strap is and draw a line straight across the top and then match it up with that folded guideline so that when you're going to sew at the machine, you want to pivot just a little bit so that you can make sure that your strap is going to sew straight across the top, and when you flip it up, it's going to pull straight. And you want to do this on the back and the front straps. And once this is done, we're going to sew along that folded edge as the guide all the way along the bias facing. And make sure that when you do come to your straps with your needle down, you're just going to give it a little pivot and make sure that you're sewing along that drawn guideline that you have done. And you can see once it's all sewn, it should follow that guideline that you've drawn. And when you flip over your straps, they should pull up straight. And when you have checked all 4 straps, if you want to, you can go back and reinforce the stitching just to make sure that it's extra secure. So from here, we're going to be turning in the bias facing the entire way around the top. So as we did with the armhole, you just want to fold it to that first stitch line and then fold it over completely again. When you are folding right near the join of the tie and the end at the top, make sure you're getting in all of those raw edges. As there aren't any serious curves on the neckline, you don't need to worry about cutting out all the triangles. You just want to continue the whole way around the neckline, folding to that first seam line and then folding it in again, making sure all the raw edges are tucked up inside the bias facing. You also want to make sure that your frill is flat when you are pinning it and there's no little folds there. So when you come to the strap, you just want to trim off any excess that you're going to have that's going to make folding the bias tricky, and then fold the same way to the seam line and then over again, and you'll see that the strap just pops up and you can pin it in place. You want to continue to fold all along the arm frill. And when you reach the back straps, again, just give it a little trim and you're going to fold it the same way as the front straps to that first seam line and then over again. And your little straps will pop up and you can pin everything in place. And you want to continue all along the back of the top, and you don't need to do anything different or special at the V. Just continue to fold to the seam line and fold over again, pinning in place and making sure the frill is sitting flat. And once everything is pinned in place, which may feel like an eternity later, you want to come along with the iron and just give it a quick press before you go to the machine, making sure that all of the frill is sitting nice and flat, which just makes it a lot easier to sew. Starting from the tie, you're going to sew all the way around. And separately to that, you're going to start at the start of the tie and sew down one end. And you want to make sure that you have pressed that end in the same as we did as the other tie, so that you have a nice clean finish to your tie when you sew it. So starting at the neckline at the beginning of the tie, you're going to need to take out each pin before you sew each section. You want to stay as close to the edge of the bias facing as you feel comfortable. You want to take this really nice and slow and make sure that the frill isn't getting caught up underneath. This is also going to be the line of stitching that you will see on the front of the dress. So make sure you're keeping it as even as possible and just going nice and slow and taking your time. And once you finish the neckline, you want to start from the beginning of the tie and sew down the open side. Take this nice and slowly as well. Don't feel like you need to rush, as it can be quite easy to slip off the side of the tie. And once you finish, you want to go over the entire neckline, giving it an extremely good press, as this is going to help the neckline sit well across the whole dress. If you try it on and it's not sitting properly, make sure you go back and give it another press, as it makes a world of difference. Finally, you're going to want to go and press those ties, as they may be looking a little wavy from sewing them. So you want to take your strap and slide on the strap adjuster. You're then going to loop it through the loop hole, and then you're going to turn it over and slide it back through that same strap adjuster again, as you are going back the other way. This can be a little bit tricky, but make sure you give yourself a lot of spare room on the strap that's already thread through. And once you've got it back through, you're just going to tack it to that first strap closest to it. This is where you are going to need a needle and thread, because it is a lot easier to tack in place with hand sewing. So you just want to go backwards and forwards, trying to get as close to the hole as you first made, so that your stitches are almost invisible. And you want to secure the strap on both sides, making sure that you are only sewing the two together and not the one on top. Otherwise, your adjustable strap won't be able to move. And once you finish sewing, give it a snip and you should have a beautiful adjustable strap. And lastly, we're going to sew a closure on your top. So you want to first try it on and mark the point you want your closure to be. On the under wrap, we're going to put the loop. So you want to line it up so the mark is in the middle of the loop. Then you're going to stitch it on the back side where the facing is, and the trick here is to make sure that you're only stitching on the first layer of that facing, so you can't see any of the stitching on the other side of your top. And you want to secure this on both sides and end with a few little loops to secure. You can see on the other side that you won't see any stitching. On the other side, you're going to put the hook. Again, you want to place it so it's in line with that mark, and only so on the bias side. Make sure that it is nice and secure on both sides, and you can even do a few stitches over the front of the hook and end with some knots to secure. And you've now completed your Freya Belle wrap dress.